Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a truly urgent and complex deep dive into the ongoing situation surrounding the Gaza conflict.
It really is. It's a topic with so many layers constantly unfolding and impacts lives on such a massive scale.
Absolutely. For this deep dive, we've pulled together a fascinating mix of sources for you. We've got the actual text of proposed ceasefire agreements.
Detailed analyses of how key players see things, timelines.
Yeah, timelines of critical events, and even a really lively online discussion highlighting the huge challenges around humanitarian aid delivery. It's quite a mix.
It certainly is.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
We want to help you quickly cut through some of the noise and understand the core elements of the proposed ceasefire. We'll also try to grasp the incredibly contentious issues surrounding aid distribution, identify the roles of the key players, and importantly, examine the serious allegations of international crimes that have been raised. By the end, you should feel, hopefully, much better informed on this vital global issue.
And what's crucial to understand here, I think, is just how interconnected all these pieces are. Every action, every statement, every proposed solution, it all influences the others, sometimes in surprising, often challenging ways.
Right. Understanding one part really does help illuminate the whole picture.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's start with the proposed ceasefire agreement itself. Our sources detail a comprehensive three-stage plan. Hamas reportedly accepted this version back on May 6, 2024.
Right, and each of these stages is designed to last for 42 days. That's the framework.
42 days each.
If we look at the bigger picture here, the overarching goal is, well, it's ambitious. It aims for the release of all Israeli detainees in Gaza, civilian soldiers alive or sadly deceased.
In exchange for Palestinian prisoners.
Precisely. And beyond that prisoner exchange, it's about achieving a true sustainable calm, a permanent ceasefire eventually, and then the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and ultimately a huge reconstruction effort.
Okay, let's dive into the specifics of that first stage, the initial 42 days. What happens militarily?
Well, it envisions a temporary cessation of hostilities, mutual cessation.
So, a pause in the fighting.
Yes. And Israeli forces would withdraw eastward, away from the densely populated areas, more towards the border regions.
Okay.
There'll also be a daily halt to air operations, reconnaissance, bombing, etc. 10 hours normally, but extended to 12 hours on days when detainees are actually being released.
Got it. And what about the displaced people? That's a huge issue.
Yeah, absolutely critical. The agreement outlines a phased return just 3 days into the ceasefire, assuming the initial release of 3 detainees goes ahead. Israeli forces would pull back from key routes like Al-Rashid Street, dismantle military sites there, allowing displaced people to start returning home.
And move freely within certain areas, right?
Yes, that's the idea. Though, importantly, the text says without weapons.
Right.
Then later, on day 22, after about half the civilian detainees are supposed to be released, there'd be further withdrawals from central Gaza. That would allow returns to North Gaza, again with dismantling of military sites.
And humanitarian aid that starts immediately.
Oh, from day one. That's paramount. The plan calls for large quantities of aid and fuel entering daily.
How much were we talking?
The target is 600 trucks a day. That includes 50 trucks of fuel, and critically, 300 of those trucks are specifically designated for the north, which has been very hard hit.
And that fuel isn't just for transport.
No, it's vital for everything. Electricity generation, commerce, powering equipment to clear rubble, getting hospitals, health centers, bakeries back online across all of Gaza. And this level of aid, importantly, is meant to continue throughout all 3 stages of the agreement. Not just the first 42 days.
Okay, let's talk about the detainee and prisoner exchange in that first stage. It sounds incredibly complex.
It is. Very detailed and obviously highly sensitive. Hamas would release 33 Israeli detainees. Now, this group could include living individuals or the bodies of those who've died.
In specific categories?
Yes. Women, both civilians and soldiers, children under 19 who aren't soldiers, the elderly over 50, and sick or wounded civilians.
And in return?
In return, Israel releases Palestinian prisoners based on lists that Hamas provides. The ratios are very specific. For instance, 30 elderly or sick Palestinian prisoners for every elderly, sick, or wounded Israeli civilian detainee released.
Wow.
And for every living Israeli female soldier released, Israel would release 50 prisoners. And get this, 30 of those 50 would be prisoners serving life sentences.
That's significant leverage.
Absolutely. The agreement also includes legal safeguards, things like ensuring liberated Palestinian prisoners aren't just rearrested on the same charges later.
And the timing. It's not all at once.
No, it's staggered. 3 Israeli detainees on day 3, then 3 more every 7 days. Women prioritize where possible. The remaining civilian detainees in that initial group of 33 would be released in week 6. Hamas has to provide info on the numbers by day 7.
What if there aren't 33 living detainees in those categories?
Then the agreement states that the bodies of deceased detainees from the same categories would be used to make up the number to 33.
And there's a provision for Palestinian women and children arrested after October 7th.
Yes, Israel would release all of them in week 5 of this first stage.
Okay, so that's the intense first 42 days. But what happens after that, if it holds?
Well, the agreement outlines 2 more 42-day stages. Stage 2 is where you see the shift towards permanence. It would focus on achieving what the text calls sustainable calm, basically a permanent end to all military operations.
A real ceasefire.
Exactly. And during this stage, all remaining living Israeli men, civilians, and soldiers would be exchanged for another agreed number of Palestinian prisoners. Crucially, this stage culminates in a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
That's a huge step.
Monumental. A leap from a temporary truce to potentially an enduring cessation of hostilities.
And then stage 3, also 42 days.
Yes, this stage deals primarily with the exchange of bodies and remains from both sides. Grim, but necessary.
And reconstruction.
Yes, this stage marks the formal beginning of Gaza's comprehensive reconstruction, a massive task estimated to take 3 to 5 years. And importantly, it would happen under international supervision: Qatar, Egypt, the U.S., the UN.
And it ends with lifting the siege.
That's the final piece mentioned for stage 3, ending the complete siege on Gaza.
And you mentioned the guarantors: Qatar, Egypt, the U.S., the UN.
That's right. They're named as guarantors of the agreement, which of course raises a really important question for you, the listener, to think about. With so many moving parts, such deeply entrenched positions on all sides, and all these international actors involved, what are the real chances of a plan this ambitious actually holding together?
That's a huge question, and it leads directly into the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The battle over aid. Because here's where things get incredibly contentious, really divisive, and frankly heart-wrenching. The delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza is a major flashpoint.
It really is. And the viewpoints are just wildly conflicting. Some sources, particularly looking at, say, online discussions we reviewed, present a perspective that there has been ample aid entering Gaza.
Ample aid, how so?
Well, one user, for instance, crunched some numbers, suggesting hundreds of thousands of tons of food aid entered Gaza over just a couple of months. Their calculation, based on estimated caloric values, argued this was theoretically enough food to last Gaza's entire population for many months, maybe even until October 2025.
So if the aid is there, what's the problem, according to that view?
This perspective often suggests the core problem isn't a lack of food entering, but, and I quote, the food isn't reaching people that need it.
Meaning?
Well, this viewpoint frequently includes serious accusations that groups inside Gaza Hamas is often named, along with other local factions or gangs, are systematically stealing and stockpiling the aid. The claim is they divert it, sell it on the black market at eye-watering prices.
To fund operations.
Exactly. To fund military efforts, feed their own fighters, maybe even recruit new members. Some estimates cited profits in the hundreds of millions of dollars from this alleged black market.
And the argument then is?
The argument stemming from this is that Israel shouldn't be blamed if aid it allows in is then diverted internally. And furthermore, that international law might even permit stopping aid if there's clear evidence it's being diverted to military efforts by the opposing side.
Okay, that's one perspective. But there's a very strong counter-narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The aid obstruction and starvation perspective, drawn from other sources, fiercely disputes those ample aid calculations.
On what grounds?
Several. They point to things like the weight of packaging itself being included in tonnage, which isn't edible. The type of food matters. Caloric density varies hugely. It's not all high-calorie flour. Then there's massive spoilage because of the lack of storage, refrigeration, the general chaos. Unequal distribution is another huge factor.
And the impact of the conflict itself.
Yes. The destruction of aid by military actions, direct hits on bakeries, on aid convoys, on the buildings where people would store or receive food. Estimates from this side suggest food supplies ran out much, much sooner.
And this perspective goes further, right? It includes direct accusations against Israel.
It does. Multiple sources, including UN bodies like the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, directly accuse Israel of intentionally using starvation as a method of warfare.
That's an incredibly serious charge.
It is. They accuse Israel of deliberately blocking aid. We even found a quote attributed to an Israeli lawmaker, Moshe Saada, saying, "I do want to starve the Gazans. Yes, absolutely, it is our duty."
What kind of blocking methods are alleged?
Things like what are termed Bacchus inspections, basically, overly meticulous or arbitrary inspections designed to slow or stop aid flow. There are also horrific reports of civilians being shot while trying to get supplies, and even drone strikes targeting the local guards assigned to protect aid convoys.
And the dual-use policy.
Right, that's another point raised. Israel's policy restricts items that could theoretically have a military application, even if they're vital for civilian life. Things like pipes for water or sewage, concrete for rebuilding. Critics say this policy severely hinders not just immediate aid, but any chance of recovery or reconstruction.
So even if aid gets to Gaza, getting it to people is another huge challenge.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core distribution problems. Israel has apparently offered to allow aid if it goes directly to civilians through distribution centers they control or supervise.
How was that received?
According to reports, the UN and other major aid organizations rejected this. They cited unreasonable restrictions imposed by Israel. These allegedly included things like setting specific, possibly insufficient calorie allowances per person and requiring people, many displaced and vulnerable, to travel long, dangerous distances to these centers.
And what about UNRWA, the main UN agency there?
That's another layer of complexity. Some sources claim UNRWA, perhaps alongside Hamas, insists that only UNRWA should handle aid distribution. Israel reportedly rejects this, citing security reasons.
Stemming from those allegations against UNRWA staff?
Precisely. The allegations that some UNRWA employees participated in the October 7th attack or have affiliations with Hamas. Those allegations, you'll remember, led several countries, the US, Canada, Germany, others, to suspend their funding for UNRWA, at least for a time.
So UNRWA's capacity is diminished and there's mistrust.
Yes. The U.S. did financially support a new group, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to try and fill the gap. But even that effort, according to reports, has faced frequent reports of fatal shootings by Israeli forces near food distribution sites. It's incredibly dangerous work.
So the overall picture is chaos.
Pretty much. Yeah. Chaos, violence, and deep mistrust preventing aid from reaching those in desperate need, almost regardless of who is nominally in charge of distributing it. The real insight here maybe is that the humanitarian crisis isn't just about logistics or supply anymore. It's become a deeply politicized battleground. Aid itself seems to have become weaponized by different sides, making genuine relief incredibly difficult to achieve, let alone verify who's getting what.
It's just astonishing how deeply ingrained these conflicting narratives are, especially when human lives are literally hanging in the balance. All right. Given all this complexity, what does it mean for the key players, for the politics and diplomacy surrounding the conflict?
Well, if we look at the impact on Palestinian factions first, the ongoing Israeli military actions, not just in Gaza but also in the West Bank, seem to be seriously eroding the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
How so?
Some critics we reviewed see the PA as ineffective, or worse, an accomplice to Israeli aggression because it hasn't been able to stop it. Some sources even predict the PA's eventual collapse.
And Hamas?
Conversely, Hamas, according to these analyses, appears to be gaining popular legitimacy, at least in some quarters. They're seen as the primary resistance force against the occupation. And, of course, they maintain significant leverage by continuing to hold Israeli hostages.
What about Israel's position? Prime Minister Netanyahu's stance seems very firm.
Extremely firm, at least publicly. He has consistently stated he will not end the war until Hamas is, in his words, defeated, totally dismantled.
And he's added conditions beyond just the hostage release and ceasefire.
Yes. Our sources mention demands like Hamas laying down all its arms, the exile of its political and military leaders. And, very controversially, there are reports linking his position to the idea of expulsion of the Palestinian population from Gaza.
That's been widely condemned.
As ethnic cleansing, yes. Some sources explicitly link this to what they call Trump's plan for Gaza, though the specifics of that remain unclear.
But didn't former President Trump announce a potential deal?
He did. On July 1st, 2025, Trump announced that Israel had agreed to terms for a 60-day ceasefire and urged Hamas to accept it. He said, "It will not get better, it will only get worse."
But Israel denies agreeing.
Anonymously, yes. Israeli officials briefed that they hadn't agreed to that specific deal, that negotiations were still ongoing, and that Hamas's proposals at the time were unacceptable. Though, interestingly, some other sources suggest a feeling, perhaps among analysts or diplomats, that Israel might be reaching the end of its military strategic political world, meaning its options are narrowing.
And Hamas's core demand hasn't changed.
Seems not. Their bottom line, repeated in various communications, is the full withdrawal of all Israeli forces from Gaza and a complete cessation of all military actions. They see that as fundamental for any true resolution and a permanent ceasefire, and they've consistently rejected calls for their disarmament as a precondition.
So where does that leave the mediators, the U.S., Egypt, Qatar?
They're caught in the middle, trying to bridge these huge gaps. The U.S. is described as a key mediator and guarantor. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, reportedly did reach a draft deal with Hamas in Doha. That was for the 60-day ceasefire, release of 10 captives initially, with the U.S. president supposedly guaranteeing the terms, including Israeli troop withdrawal and unconditional aid flow.
But again, Israel denied agreeing to that specific draft.
Correct. It highlights the difficulty. Egypt and Qatar remain pivotal. They're hosting talks, trying to facilitate aid, deeply involved in planning for Gaza's eventual reconstruction. Their public statements consistently emphasize the urgent need to get back to a ceasefire and ensure aid flows without hindrance.
And the wider international context.
It's putting pressure on, certainly. There's growing international pressure on Netanyahu's government. Some sources suggest that this external pressure, particularly from the U.S., but also things like boycotts against Israeli academics or investors, might be the most effective lever right now.
You mentioned Trump's view of Netanyahu.
Yes, some reports or analyses describe Trump as viewing Netanyahu privately as a loser for not achieving his stated war aims after all this time. How much that influences things is hard to say.
Oh, regionally.
Still very tense. We've seen recent mutual strikes between Israel and Iran, though contained for now. And the Houthi rebels in Yemen continue to vow support for Gaza, launching attacks, saying they won't stop until the aggression and siege cease.
It's an incredibly volatile mix.
Absolutely.
Which unfortunately brings us to the gravest part of this deep dive, the allegations of atrocity crimes. Both sides are facing extremely serious accusations.
They are. Starting with Hamas, they stand accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the October 7, 2023 assault on Israel. That involved the targeted killing of civilians and the abduction of over 250 hostages.
And the rockets.
Yes. They're also accused of launching thousands of indiscriminate rockets into populated areas in Israel, which, by their nature, cannot distinguish between civilian and military targets. That's a war crime.
And the accusations against Israel.
They are extensive and severe. Israel is accused by various bodies, including UN commissions and rapporteurs, of committing mass atrocity crimes. This umbrella includes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and, most controversially, the crime of genocide since October 7, 2023.
What are the specific allegations?
The UN reports we reviewed list several. Using starvation as a method of warfare, which we discussed with the aid blockages. Intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, homes, hospitals, schools, allegations of sexual violence, torture, forcible transfer of the population.
Forcible transfer meaning the displacement.
Yes, the mass displacement of roughly 90% of Gaza's population into what are described as unsafe, overcrowded areas, often under continued bombardment. There are also allegations of deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities, which are protected under international law.
Some sources use very strong language to describe Israel's military strategy.
They do. Phrases like consistent with the characteristics of genocide or an eliminationist conduct of hostilities. One concept mentioned is humanitarian camouflage, essentially. Actions allegedly taken to blur the lines between civilians and combatants, thereby trying to legitimize attacks on civilian infrastructure.
And the sheer scale of destruction.
It's staggering. Widespread bombardment has left much of Gaza simply uninhabitable. Estimates cited suggest nearly 70% of all buildings destroyed, including 92% of homes and 88% of schools, plus hospitals, mosques, churches, bakeries, vital infrastructure.
And this isn't just limited to Gaza.
No. The reports also detail escalating violence in the occupied West Bank, including large-scale military assaults on cities and refugee camps, and a significant increase in settler violence against Palestinians, often allegedly with little intervention or even complicity from Israeli forces.
This all raises huge questions about accountability.
Huge. There are significant concerns voiced in our sources that the international community has largely failed in its responsibility to prevent these alleged crimes. Some countries are criticized for potentially risking complicity by continuing arms sales to Israel amidst these allegations.
Undermining international law.
That's the argument. Critics say that blanket support for Israel, without sufficient regard for its actions, undermines the credibility and effectiveness of international legal systems. This is often framed as part of a long-standing pattern of impunity. The idea that both Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups have not been held accountable for past violations, which in turn enables current atrocities.
So what are the calls for action?
Strong calls for international investigative teams and human rights monitors to have immediate, unfettered access to Gaza to collect and preserve evidence, and specific calls for the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to expand its existing investigation to formally include the crime of genocide.
And the ICC has taken action recently.
Yes, in a very significant development, the ICC prosecutor applied for arrest warrants for top Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defense minister, alongside warrants for senior Hamas leaders. That's a major step towards individual accountability, though enforcement is another matter.
So we have covered a massive amount of ground today. It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
From the intricate details of that three-stage ceasefire proposal, the deeply polarizing, frankly agonizing debate over humanitarian aid,
To the clashing objectives and red lines of the key actors, Israel, Hamas, the mediators.
and finally, these incredibly grave allegations of international crimes being leveled against both sides. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And this deep dive, I hope, highlights that even if you have a detailed ceasefire agreement on paper, the path to any kind of lasting solution is just fraught with challenges. Historical grievances run so deep, the immediate objectives often seem irreconcilable, and the human suffering is just immense.
Yep.
Navigating all this information, as you said, really requires critical thinking and acknowledging that there are multiple, often completely contradictory perspectives on almost every single issue.
And understanding these layers, these different viewpoints and the facts on the ground, it isn't just about following headlines, is it? It's about grasping the real human cost and the far-reaching global implications of a conflict that continues to unfold day by day.
Absolutely. Which leads us perhaps to a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Given these deeply entrenched positions we've discussed, the seemingly endless cycle of violence and accusations, the immense difficulties on the ground, what, in your view, could possibly be the absolute minimal condition necessary? That one thing that must happen for a truly enduring peace, one that satisfies the most fundamental needs for security and dignity for both Palestinians and Israelis. What does that starting point even look like?
A profound question to leave us with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into such a critical and complex topic. We encourage you to continue your own exploration into these vital global issues.